Sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't guns or bombs. Sometimes they're just two simple words that carry the weight of brotherhood, sacrifice, and unbreakable bonds forged in the heat of battle. In a crowded military ceremony, when an arrogant colonel thought he could humiliate a quiet veteran, he had no idea he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his career. What happened next would echo through the ranks for years to come, reminding everyone present that true respect isn't earned through rank alone. It's earned through the blood, sweat, and tears shared with those who've stood beside you when death was just a heartbeat away. This is the story of Marcus Hawk 8 Rodriguez, and the two words that changed everything. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Courage in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez wiped the sweat from his brow as he checked his gear for the 100th time that morning. At 28, he had already completed 3 tours of duty, but something about this mission felt different. The intelligence reports were sketchy, the terrain was hostile, and his team was being asked to do the impossible once again. Marcus had earned his nickname Hawk 8 during his second deployment when his exceptional eyesight and uncanny ability to spot enemy positions from incredible distances saved his unit from multiple ambushes. His call sign became legendary among the troops, whispered with respect in mess halls, and repeated in after-action reports that made their way up the chain of command. The mission briefing that scorching July morning was delivered by Colonel James Mitchell, a man who had spent more time behind a desk than in the field. Mitchell was the kind of officer who measured success by statistics rather than lives saved, and he had little patience for the gritty realities of ground combat. His uniform was always pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his attitude toward enlisted men bordered on contempt. "Gentlemen," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his own importance. "Today's operation will target a high-value insurgent compound approximately 15 clicks northeast of our position. Intelligence suggests the presence of a bomb-making facility and several key Taliban leaders." Marcus studied the satellite photos spread across the briefing table. Something didn't add up. The compound's location, the reported enemy strength, the proposed insertion route, it all seemed wrong. His instincts, honed by countless hours of combat experience, were screaming warnings that he couldn't ignore. "Sir," Marcus spoke up, his voice respectful but firm, "I've operated in that sector before. The terrain doesn't match what we're seeing in these photos. That valley is a natural kill zone, and if the enemy knows we're coming..." Colonel Mitchell's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I don't recall asking for your opinion on strategic planning. Your job is to follow orders, not to question the intelligence gathered by professionals far more qualified than yourself." The room fell silent. Marcus felt the eyes of his teammates on him, their expressions a mixture of support and concern. They all knew that Marcus's tactical knowledge had kept them alive on numerous occasions, but challenging a superior officer in front of others was dangerous territory. "With respect, sir," Marcus continued, "my team has been operating in this region for 8 months. We know every rock, every ridge, every potential ambush site. The compound in these photos isn't where intelligence says it is. If we go in based on this information, we're going to walk straight into a trap." Colonel Mitchell's face flushed red with anger. "Sergeant, you are dangerously close to insubordination. I suggest you remember your place in this chain of command." But Marcus couldn't let it go. Too many good soldiers had died because of flawed intelligence and the arrogance of officers who refused to listen to the men on the ground. "Sir, I'm just asking that we verify the coordinates. Send a drone over first, or let me take a small recon team to confirm the target location." The colonel slammed his hand on the table with such force that the satellite photos scattered to the floor. "That's enough. You have your orders, Sergeant. You will lead your team to the designated coordinates. You will secure the compound, and you will do so without further questioning of this operation's parameters." Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His team, Corporal Jimmy Tank Washington, Specialist David Kim, Private First Class Miguel Santos and Sergeant First Class Robert Ghost Thompson had followed him through hell and back. They trusted him with their lives, and he had never let them down. But now he was being ordered to lead them into what he was certain was a death trap. As the briefing ended and the other officers filed out, Marcus remained behind, staring at the scattered photos. Ghost approached him, his weathered face creased with concern. "Hawk, what's your gut telling you?" Ghost asked quietly. Marcus picked up one of the satellite images, studying it intently. "My gut's telling me we're being set up to fail, Ghost. Either the intel is completely wrong, or someone wants us to walk into an ambush. So what do we do?" Marcus looked at his oldest friend, a man who had saved his life on more occasions than he could count. "We do our jobs, but we do them smart. We're going to modify the mission parameters once we're in the field." 3 hours later, Marcus and his team were aboard a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter, flying low over the barren landscape toward their target. The rhythmic thump of the rotors was hypnotic, but Marcus's mind was racing. He had studied every available map of the area, cross-referenced the coordinates with his own reconnaissance notes, and formulated an alternative plan. As they approached the landing zone, Marcus keyed his radio. "Hawk 8 to Overwatch. We're 2 minutes out from the designated LZ. "Copy that, Hawk 8. Weather's clear, no visible enemy activity in the area." But Marcus was watching the terrain below with the intensity of a predator. His trained eye caught details that others missed. The wrong type of vegetation for the supposed location, terrain features that didn't match the intelligence photos, and, most importantly, the complete absence of any structures that resembled the compound they were supposed to be targeting. As the helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. Instead of following the prescribed route to the target coordinates, he led his team in a different direction entirely. "Where are we going, Hawk?" Tank asked through the team's communication system. "Trust me," Marcus replied. "We're going to the real compound." Using his intimate knowledge of the area and years of experience reading the subtle signs of enemy activity, Marcus guided his team through a series of rocky outcroppings toward a location approximately 2 kilometers south of their assigned target. As they crested a ridge, his worst fears were confirmed. Below them, in a valley that perfectly matched the description from the intelligence briefing, was the actual compound. But it wasn't just a bomb-making facility. It was a heavily fortified position with at least 30 armed insurgents, multiple machine gun nests, and what appeared to be mortar tubes positioned to rain death on anyone approaching from the direction his team had been ordered to take. Even more chilling was the sight of the original target coordinates. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see the carefully prepared killing field, a stretch of open ground surrounded by concealed fighting positions, obviously prepared for an ambush. If his team had followed their original orders, they would have walked directly into a crossfire that would have killed them all. "Holy shit, Kim vi spirit. Hawk, you just saved our lives." But Marcus was already working on the next problem. The real compound was too heavily defended for a 5-man team to assault directly. They needed a different approach, one that would accomplish the mission while keeping his men alive. "Ghost, get on the radio to Overwatch. Tell them we have eyes on the actual target and request immediate air support," Marcus ordered. "And what do we tell them about disobeying orders?" Santos asked nervously. Marcus smiled grimly. "We tell them the truth, that following orders would have gotten us killed, and completing the mission was more important than blindly following flawed intelligence." As Ghost relayed their situation to command, Marcus positioned his team to provide laser designation for the incoming airstrike. Within 20 minutes, 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed overhead, their precision-guided munitions turning the insurgent compound into smoking rubble. The mission was a complete success. Intelligence gathered from the destroyed facility led to the capture of 3 high-value targets, and the disruption of a major bomb-making network that had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces. But for Marcus, the real victory was bringing all of his men home alive. When they returned to base 6 hours later, Colonel Mitchell was waiting for them with a face like thunder. The successful mission had complicated his plans to dress down the insubordinate sergeant, but it hadn't improved his mood. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Mitchell said coldly, "we need to discuss your unauthorized deviation from mission parameters." Marcus stood at attention, his uniform dusty and his face streaked with sweat, but his eyes steady and unrepentant. "Sir, the intelligence was flawed. Following the original plan would have resulted in unnecessary casualties. That's not your call to make, Sergeant. You don't have the clearance level or the strategic perspective to make those kinds of decisions. With respect, sir, I have a perspective of someone who's been keeping soldiers alive in this theater for 3 years. Sometimes that's the only perspective that matters." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes, the base's executive officer and a combat veteran herself. She had been monitoring the mission from the Tactical Operations Center and had witnessed the entire sequence of events. "Colonel Mitchell," she said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this in private." But Mitchell was too angry to be deterred. "No, Lieutenant Kenneth. This is exactly the kind of discipline problem that needs to be addressed publicly. Sergeant Rodriguez endangered this mission and violated direct orders." Hayes's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a hint of steel. "Sir, Sergeant Rodriguez's actions today resulted in a successful mission with 0 friendly casualties and significant enemy losses. The intelligence package was clearly compromised, and his decision to adapt to battlefield conditions demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative we want from our NCOs." Marcus watched the exchange with growing unease. He had accomplished the mission and saved his team, but he was beginning to realize that his real battle was just beginning. Colonel Mitchell was the kind of officer who valued his authority more than results, and being shown up by an enlisted man in front of his peers was not something he would forget or forgive. As the argument continued, Marcus thought about his men. Tank was already talking about re-enlisting for another tour. Kim had a wife and newborn daughter waiting for him back home. Santos was just 19 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. Ghost was planning to retire after this deployment and, finally, spend time with his grandchildren. These are the faces that Marcus saw every time he closed his eyes. These are the lives that depended on his decisions. And if protecting them meant facing the wrath of an angry colonel, then that was a price he was willing to pay. The seeds of the confrontation that would define Marcus Rodriguez's legacy were planted that day in the Afghan desert. Colonel Mitchell had been humiliated by a staff sergeant who had demonstrated better judgment and tactical acumen than his superior officer. For a man of Mitchell's ego, that was an unforgivable sin. But Marcus had no idea how far Mitchell would go to get his revenge, or how a single moment of truth would eventually echo across an entire military base, teaching everyone present a lesson about honor, respect, and the unbreakable bonds forged in combat. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legend. The weeks following the successful compound raid should have been a time of recognition and rest for Marcus and his team. Instead, they found themselves under constant scrutiny from Colonel Mitchell, who seemed determined to find fault with every aspect of their performance. What had begun as a personality conflict had evolved into something much more dangerous, a systematic campaign to destroy Marcus's military career. It started with small things, equipment inspections that were unusually thorough and repeated until violations could be found. Training exercises where Marcus's team was assigned the most difficult objectives with impossible timeframes. Administrative duties that kept them busy during their supposed rest periods. To an outside observer, it might have looked like standard military operations, but to those who knew Mitchell's character, it was clearly harassment. Marcus tried to keep his frustrations to himself, but his team could see the toll it was taking. The easy camaraderie that had carried them through dangerous missions was being replaced by tension and uncertainty. They had saved each other's lives in combat, but now they were facing an enemy they couldn't fight with weapons or tactics. "This is bullshit, Hawk," Tank said one evening as they finished yet another pointless equipment inventory. "Mitchell's trying to run us into the ground. Keep your voice down, Marcus warned, glancing around the supply tent to make sure they weren't being overheard. The last thing we need is someone reporting that we're criticizing a superior officer. But Kim wasn't willing to let it go. So what are we supposed to do? Just let him destroy our careers because he can't handle being wrong. Marcus understood his team's frustration because he felt it himself. Every morning brought new challenges designed to break their spirit or force them into making mistakes that could be used against them. Mitchell was playing a long game, building a case that would justify severe disciplinary action or even court-martial proceedings. The situation escalated dramatically when Marcus received orders to report for a formal investigation into his conduct during the compound raid. The investigation was being led by Major Patricia Coleman, a staff officer who had never served in a combat role, but who had built her career on meticulous attention to military regulations and procedures. The interview took place in a sterile conference room at the base headquarters. Major Coleman sat across from Marcus with a thick file folder and a digital recorder, her expression neutral, but her demeanor suggesting that she had already reached her conclusions. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she began, "I'm here to investigate allegations that you willfully disobeyed direct orders during Operation Desert Strike on July 15th. Marcus had expected this moment, but hearing the formal charges still hit him like a physical blow. "Ma'am, I followed the spirit of my orders while adapting to battlefield conditions that differed from the intelligence briefing. According to Colonel Mitchell's report, you were specifically ordered to proceed to designated coordinates Alpha 79er and conduct a raid on a suspected insurgent compound. Instead, you led your team to a completely different location approximately 2 kilometers away." "That's correct, ma'am. The intelligence was flawed, and the original coordinates would have led my team into an ambush." Major Coleman consulted her notes. "How did you determine that the intelligence was flawed, Sergeant? Are you qualified to make such assessments?" The question struck at the heart of the military's hierarchical structure. By what authority did an enlisted man second-guess intelligence gathered and analyzed by officers and specialists who outranked him? It was a question that had been asked throughout military history, usually in the aftermath of disasters caused by rigid adherence to flawed plans. "Ma'am, I've been operating in that sector for 8 months. I know the terrain, the enemy patterns, and the local conditions. When I saw that the target coordinates didn't match any known structures in that area, and when I observed terrain features that differed from the intelligence photos, I concluded that there had been an error. And you felt authorized to make that determination on your own?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "Ma'am, my primary responsibility is to complete the mission while protecting the lives of my soldiers. When those two objectives conflicted with following orders exactly as written, I chose to prioritize mission success and soldier safety." The investigation continued for over an hour, with Major Coleman probing every aspect of Marcus's decision-making process. She questioned his qualifications, his motivations, and his loyalty to the chain of command. It was clear that she was building a case for court-martial proceedings and that Colonel Mitchell was providing her with all the ammunition she needed. But Marcus wasn't the only one being investigated. Word had spread throughout the base about the confrontation between the colonel and the staff sergeant, and opinions were sharply divided. Among the enlisted ranks and junior officers who had served in combat, Marcus was seen as a hero who had put his career on the line to protect his men. But among the senior staff officers who worked closely with Mitchell, he was viewed as a dangerous insubordinate who threatened the entire structure of military discipline. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Major Coleman requested interviews with Marcus's team members. One by one, Tank, Kim, Santos, and Ghost were called in to provide their accounts of the mission and their assessment of their team leaders' actions. Tank was the first to be questioned, and he didn't hold back. "Ma'am, Sergeant Rodriguez saved our lives that day. If we had followed the original plan, we'd all be dead right now. I've been in this man's army for 12 years, and I've never served under a better leader." Kim's testimony was even more direct. "Ma'am, with all due respect, anyone who thinks Hawk 8 did anything wrong wasn't there. We could see the ambush site from our position. It was a killing field, pure and simple. Our sergeant made the right call. But it was Ghost's interview that really got Major Coleman's attention. As the most senior enlisted man on the team and a 20-year veteran, his words carried special weight. Major, Ghost said quietly, "I've seen good soldiers die because they followed bad orders, and I've seen good soldiers get punished for making smart decisions." What happened that day was leadership in its purest form. Sergeant Rodriguez sought a trap, adapted to the situation, and completed the mission with 0 casualties. In my book, that's exactly what we train our NCOs to do. The investigation was further complicated by the arrival of intelligence reports that confirmed Marcus's assessment of the situation. Intercepted communications revealed that insurgent forces had indeed been aware of the planned raid and had prepared an elaborate ambush at the original target coordinates. The flawed intelligence package had been the result of a compromised source who had deliberately provided false information. Major Coleman found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The evidence clearly supported Marcus's actions, but Colonel Mitchell was insisting that the principle of military discipline was more important than the results. The colonel wanted Marcus court-martialed as an example to other soldiers who might be tempted to question their orders. The tension came to a head during a senior staff meeting where the investigation's findings were presented to the base command. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes argued forcefully that Marcus should be commended rather than punished, while Colonel Mitchell maintained that allowing insubordination to go unpunished would undermine military discipline throughout the theater. The issue isn't whether Sergeant Rodriguez's actions were tactically sound, Mitchell argued. The issue is whether we're going to allow enlisted personnel to pick and choose which orders they follow based on their personal judgment. With respect, sir, Hayes responded, we train our soldiers to think, adapt, and overcome. Sergeant Rodriguez did exactly what we've been telling our NCOs to do for decades. He used his initiative to accomplish the mission. The debate raged for hours, with officers lining up on both sides of the issue. Some argued that Marcus's actions represented the kind of flexible thinking that had made the American military successful in unconventional warfare. Others insisted that allowing subordinates to second-guess their superiors would lead to chaos and the breakdown of military order. As the investigation dragged on, Marcus continued to perform his duties while living under the constant threat of court-martial. His team remained loyal, but the stress was beginning to show. The easy confidence that had characterized their operations was being replaced by a watchful wariness, as if they were always looking over their shoulders for the next bureaucratic ambush. The situation was made worse by the knowledge that Mitchell was not limiting his campaign to official channels. Officers who supported Marcus found themselves facing increased scrutiny of their own records. Enlisted personnel who spoke favorably about the staff sergeant were given undesirable assignments or recommended for transfer to less desirable postings. It was a textbook example of how a vindictive officer could use the military's hierarchical structure to wage a personal vendetta. Mitchell had turned the investigation into a weapon, using it to punish anyone who dared to challenge his authority or question his judgment. But Marcus had allies that Mitchell hadn't counted on. The story of the compound raid had spread throughout the military community, carried by soldiers rotating between bases and officers attending briefings at higher headquarters. What had begun as a local dispute was becoming a cause célèbre among those who believe in the principle that good leadership meant protecting your people, even when it meant taking risks. Command Sergeant Major William Iron Mike Patterson, the senior enlisted advisor to the base commander, had been quietly conducting his own investigation into the incident. As a 30-year veteran who had served in every major conflict since Vietnam, Patterson had seen his share of conflicts between officers and enlisted personnel. But the Hawk 8 case was different because of the clear evidence that Marcus had been right and Mitchell had been wrong. Patterson's report to the base commander was blunt and uncompromising. Sir, this investigation has become a witch hunt. Sergeant Rodriguez acted exactly as we would expect from a seasoned NCO faced with flawed intelligence and a dangerous tactical situation. If we punish him for using sound judgment and tactical expertise, we're sending a message to every soldier in this command that blind obedience is more important than mission success and soldier safety. The intervention of the senior enlisted advisor added a new dimension to the controversy. Patterson's reputation was unassailable, and his judgment was respected throughout the command structure. His support for Marcus carried weight that civilian college graduates and staff officers couldn't match. As the investigation entered its third week, it became clear that Colonel Mitchell had overplayed his hand. What he had intended as a quick lesson in military discipline had become a prolonged examination of his own leadership style and decision-making abilities. Every day that the case remained open was another day for people to question why an obviously successful mission was being treated as a disciplinary matter. The psychological pressure on Marcus was enormous. He had enlisted in the Army to serve his country and protect his fellow soldiers, not to become the center of a political controversy. The uncertainty about his future was affecting his sleep, his appetite, and his ability to focus on his duties. But he was sustained by the unwavering support of his team and the growing recognition that his case had become symbolic of larger issues within the military. The investigation was about to take another dramatic turn that would shift the balance of power and set the stage for the confrontation that would make Marcus Rodriguez a legend. But first, he would have to endure one more attempt by Colonel Mitchell to destroy his career and silence anyone who dared to question the colonel's authority. The real battle was just beginning. The turning point in Marcus Rodriguez's ordeal came from an unexpected source, a classified after-action report that found its way into the hands of General Robert Mad Dog McKinley, the commanding general of Regional Command South. The report detailed not just the successful compound raid, but also the intelligence failures that had nearly led to a catastrophic ambush of American forces. General McKinley was old-school military, a combat veteran who had risen through the ranks during some of the Army's most challenging deployments. He had little patience for officers who let personal vendettas interfere with military effectiveness, and even less tolerance for situations where good soldiers were punished for demonstrating exactly the kind of initiative the Army needed in modern warfare. When McKinley's aide-de-camp, Major Lisa Chun, briefed him on the situation at Forward Operating Base Courage, the general's reaction was swift and decisive. Within hours, a message was transmitted to the base commander ordering an immediate halt to all disciplinary proceedings against Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, pending a comprehensive review by regional headquarters. The message hit Colonel Mitchell like a thunderbolt. Not only was his carefully orchestrated campaign against Marcus suddenly derailed, but the intervention from such a high level suggested that his own conduct was now under scrutiny. Officers who had been quietly supporting his position began to distance themselves, sensing that the political winds had shifted dramatically. But the general's intervention did more than just protect Marcus from immediate punishment. It also sent a clear signal throughout the command that the Army valued soldiers who demonstrated tactical excellence and moral courage, even when their actions conflicted with the preferences of their immediate superiors. Word of the development spread through the base like wildfire. In enlisted quarters, mess halls, and maintenance areas where the real work of the Army was done, soldiers who had been quietly supporting Marcus felt vindicated. The system had worked, albeit slowly and imperfectly, to protect a good soldier from a vindictive officer. Marcus himself received the news with mixed emotions. Relief that the investigation was suspended was tempered by the realization that his relationship with Colonel Mitchell was now irreparably damaged. As long as Mitchell remained in command of the base, Marcus would be walking a tightrope, always vulnerable to new forms of retaliation. The situation was further complicated by the arrival of a congressional delegation that was touring military installations as part of an oversight visit. Among the delegation members was Congressman James Walsh, a former Marine who served on the House Armed Services Committee and who had a reputation for asking tough questions about military readiness and leadership. During the delegation's visit to Forward Operating Base Courage, Walsh requested a private meeting with several enlisted personnel to get their unvarnished assessment of conditions and morale. It was the kind of informal session that made officers nervous because soldiers might speak more freely about problems that weren't making their way up the chain of command. Marcus was among the soldiers selected for the discussion, along with representatives from other units throughout the base. The meeting was held in the base conference room, with only Congressman Walsh, his aide, and the senior enlisted advisor Command Sergeant Major Patterson present. Walsh began with general questions about equipment, training, and family support services. But as the discussion progressed, he began to probe deeper into issues of leadership and decision-making. It was clear that he had been briefed on the recent controversy surrounding the compound raid, and was seeking first-hand accounts from those involved. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Walsh said, looking directly at Marcus, "I understand you were involved in a successful operation that's generated some discussion about tactics and orders. Can you tell me about that situation from your perspective?" Marcus felt the weight of the moment. Here was an opportunity to tell his story to someone with the power to effect real change. But he also knew that speaking too freely about his superior officers could end his military career. He chose his words carefully. "Congressman, we were given a mission to raid a suspected insurgent compound based on intelligence reports that proved to be inaccurate. When we reached the area, it became clear that following our original orders would have put my team in extreme danger with little chance of mission success. I made the decision to adapt to the actual tactical situation, and we were able to complete the mission without casualties. And there were consequences for making that decision. Sir, there was some discussion about whether my actions were appropriate, but the chain of command has ultimately supported the mission results." Walsh's expression suggested that he understood exactly what Marcus wasn't saying. "In your opinion, Sergeant, should soldiers be encouraged to use their tactical judgment when faced with situations that differ from their original briefings?" It was a loaded question that went to the heart of military doctrine and leadership philosophy. Marcus knew that his answer could be interpreted as criticism of Colonel Mitchell, but he also knew that his honesty could help other soldiers facing similar situations in the future. "Sir, I believe that soldiers should be trained to think and adapt, especially in combat situations where conditions change rapidly. But that training has to be balanced with discipline and respect for the chain of command. It's a judgment call that has to be made by the soldier on the ground based on their experience and their assessment of the risks." Congressman Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "And in your experience, are soldiers generally supported when they make those kinds of judgment calls?" The question hung in the air for several seconds before Marcus answered. "Sir, it depends on the leadership. Some officers understand that combat is unpredictable and that rigid adherence to plans can sometimes be counterproductive. Others prioritize compliance with orders above all other considerations." The conversation continued for another hour, with Walsh asking detailed questions about training, equipment, and the relationship between officers and enlisted personnel. It was clear that he was gathering information for a comprehensive assessment of military readiness and effectiveness. After the congressional delegation departed, the atmosphere on the base remained tense. Colonel Mitchell had been conspicuously absent during much of the visit, officially due to pressing operational requirements, but more likely because he wanted to avoid difficult questions about his leadership style and recent decisions. The reprieve from the formal investigation gave Marcus and his team a chance to return to something resembling normal operations. They resumed their regular patrol and security duties, though always with the awareness that their situation remained precarious. Mitchell's resentment hadn't disappeared. It had simply been forced underground by higher-level intervention. During this period, Marcus began to receive messages of support from unexpected sources. Soldiers from other units, officers from different commands, and even some veterans who had heard about the case through military networks reached out to express their solidarity. The story of Hawk 8 had resonated throughout the military community as a symbol of the tension between obedience and initiative that every soldier faced. One of the most meaningful messages came from retired Sergeant Major Carlos Vega, who had served as Marcus's mentor during his early years in the Army. Vega had been following the case through his network of active duty contacts and had some pointed advice for his former student. Marcus, Vega wrote, "You're fighting the right fight, but you need to understand what you're really up against. This isn't just about one bad officer or one questionable order. This is about whether the Army is going to trust its soldiers to think and adapt, or whether it's going to become so rigid and bureaucratic that it loses its effectiveness. Your case has become a test case for that bigger question." The wisdom in Vega's words was evident in the broader context of military transformation. The Army was struggling to adapt to new forms of warfare that required flexibility, creativity, and independent thinking from soldiers at all levels. But that adaptation was being resisted by officers who viewed any challenge to traditional authority structures as a threat to military discipline. As weeks passed, Marcus began to see evidence of this larger transformation playing out in small ways throughout the base. Younger officers seemed more willing to listen to input from their enlisted personnel. Training exercises began to emphasize adaptive thinking and tactical flexibility. There was a subtle but noticeable shift toward recognizing that experience and expertise didn't always correlate with rank. But these changes also created new tensions. Officers like Colonel Mitchell, who had built their careers on strict hierarchy and unquestioning obedience, felt threatened by any movement toward more collaborative leadership styles. They saw the support from Marcus as a challenge to their authority and began to push back in various ways. The conflict came to a head during a base-wide ceremony honoring soldiers who had demonstrated exceptional performance during recent operations. Marcus and his team were among those being recognized for their successful completion of multiple missions, including the controversial compound raid. As Marcus stood in formation with his fellow soldiers, he couldn't help but notice Colonel Mitchell's expression of barely contained anger. The colonel was required to participate in the ceremony and to publicly recognize soldiers whose actions he had been trying to punish in private. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The ceremony was conducted by visiting Brigadier General Sandra Torres, who had specifically requested to meet with some of the soldiers whose actions had garnered attention at higher headquarters. General Torres was known throughout the command for her no-nonsense approach to leadership and her willingness to support soldiers who demonstrated courage and initiative. When she reached Marcus in the formation, General Torres paused longer than usual. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said in a voice that carried across the entire formation, "I understand you've shown exceptional leadership during some challenging operations." "Thank you, ma'am. I've been fortunate to serve with an outstanding team. Leadership often requires difficult decisions, Sergeant. It requires the courage to do what's right even when it's not easy. The Army needs more soldiers who understand that." The general's words were obviously intended for a broader audience than just Marcus. Every officer present understood that they were hearing a clear statement about the kind of leadership the Army valued, and that rigid adherence to flawed orders was not among those valued traits. Colonel Mitchell's face had turned red during this exchange, and his hands were clenched at his sides. Being lectured about leadership in front of his own soldiers by a general who was obviously supporting the man he had been trying to destroy was a humiliation that cut to the core of his identity as an officer. After the ceremony, as soldiers were dismissed and began to disperse, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Command Sergeant Major Patterson, whose expression was serious but not unfriendly. "Rodriguez, walk with me," Patterson said. They walked in silence toward the base headquarters, past soldiers going about their daily duties and vehicles moving equipment and supplies. Patterson didn't speak until they were away from the crowd of soldiers, leaving the ceremony. "Son," Patterson began, "you've been through hell these past few weeks, but I want you to understand something. What you did out there in the field wasn't just good soldiering, it was leadership. You put the mission and your men ahead of your own career, and that's exactly what we need from our NCOs." Marcus felt a surge of emotion that he had been suppressing for weeks. Hearing those words from the senior enlisted soldier on the base meant more to him than any medal or commendation. "Thank you, Sergeant Major. I just did what I thought was right." "I know you did. And that's why what's about to happen is so important." Marcus looked at Patterson with confusion. "What's about to happen?" The senior NCO smiled for the first time in the conversation. "Let's just say that Colonel Mitchell's time as the authority figure on this base is about to come to an end. And when it does, everyone's going to see what real leadership looks like." The stage was being set for a confrontation that would become military legend, a moment when years of tension between rigid authority and adaptive leadership would be resolved in the most public and dramatic way possible. Marcus Rodriguez had no idea that his greatest challenge and his ultimate vindication were both just days away. The morning of December 15th dawned clear and cold at forward operating base Courage, with temperatures dropping to near freezing in the pre-dawn hours. It was the day of the base's quarterly awards ceremony, an event that typically drew little attention beyond the soldiers being honored and their immediate supervisors. But this ceremony would be different, marked by the presence of Lieutenant General Patricia Morrison, the commanding general of all forces in the region, who had flown in specifically to present several high-level awards. Marcus Rodriguez had been informed the night before that he would be receiving the Bronze Star Medal for his actions during the compound raid, along with his entire team receiving various commendations for their performance during multiple operations. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being decorated for the same actions that Colonel Mitchell had tried to have him court-martialed for. The ceremony was held in the base's main hangar, which had been cleared of aircraft and decorated with flags and military banners. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows for the assembled personnel, while a small stage at the front held the podium and display table for the awards. The entire base population was required to attend, from the newest privates to the senior staff officers. As soldiers filed into the hangar, the tension between different factions was palpable. Officers and NCOs who had supported Marcus sat with barely concealed satisfaction, while those who had sided with Colonel Mitchell appeared uncomfortable and subdued. Everyone sensed that this ceremony would be more than a routine recognition event. Colonel Mitchell himself appeared increasingly agitated as the morning progressed. He had fought unsuccessfully to have Marcus's award downgraded or delayed, but had been overruled by higher headquarters. The prospect of having to publicly honor a soldier he considered insubordinate was eating at him like acid. The ceremony began with the traditional protocol, posting of the colors, invocation, and remarks by the base commander. But everyone was waiting for the moment when General Morrison would take the podium. As a three-star general with over 30 years of service, including multiple combat tours, her words would carry tremendous weight throughout the command. When General Morrison finally approached the podium, the hangar fell completely silent. She was an imposing figure, not particularly tall, but radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of successful leadership in the world's most demanding profession. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily throughout the hangar, "we're here today to recognize soldiers who have demonstrated the highest standards of military excellence. But before we begin the formal presentations, I want to talk about what military excellence really means." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Something in the general's tone suggested that this would not be a routine ceremony speech. "Military excellence," Morrison continued, "isn't just about following orders or maintaining standards or adhering to regulations. Those things are important, but they're not enough. Military excellence requires the courage to make difficult decisions under pressure, the wisdom to adapt when circumstances change, and the moral courage to do what's right even when it's not easy." Around the hangar, soldiers were exchanging glances. This was clearly building towards something significant, though no one was sure what. "I've spent the past several weeks reviewing operations conducted by this command, and I've been particularly interested in cases where soldiers demonstrated exceptional judgment under challenging circumstances. Today, we're going to honor some of those soldiers, but I also want to address some concerns that have been raised about how we evaluate and reward military performance. Colonel Mitchell's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand that this ceremony was not going to proceed as he had expected. General Morrison gestured toward the seated soldiers. We have with us today Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, known to his teammates as Hawk 8. Sergeant Rodriguez recently led his team on an operation that has generated considerable discussion about tactics, leadership, and the relationship between orders and judgment. Marcus felt every eye in the hangar turned toward him. His team members, seated in the row behind him, leaned forward slightly in support. He could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. Sergeant Rodriguez was given orders to conduct a raid based on intelligence that proved to be not just incorrect, but deliberately falsified by enemy sources intended to lure American forces into an ambush. When Sergeant Rodriguez recognized that following his orders would likely result in the deaths of his entire team, he made the decision to adapt his tactics while still accomplishing his mission. The general paused, letting her words sink in throughout the hangar. The result was a completely successful operation with 0 friendly casualties and significant enemy losses. The intelligence gathered during that operation led to the capture of multiple high-value targets and the disruption of a major bomb-making network. By any reasonable measure, it was exactly the kind of performance we should expect from our soldiers. Marcus could see Colonel Mitchell fidgeting in his seat among the other senior officers. The colonel's face was flushed red, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. However, General Morrison continued, I understand that there was some question about whether Sergeant Rodriguez's actions were appropriate, whether an enlisted soldier should make the kinds of tactical decisions he made that day. I want to address that question directly. The hangar was so quiet that the sound of aircraft engines from the nearby runway seemed deafeningly loud. The United States Army has always prided itself on the initiative and adaptability of its soldiers at every level. We train our people to think, to analyze, to adapt to changing circumstances. We expect our soldiers to use their judgment, their experience, and their tactical knowledge to accomplish their missions while protecting their people. That's not insubordination, that's leadership. A murmur of approval rippled through the enlisted ranks, quickly suppressed, but clearly audible. I've read the after-action reports from this operation, Morrison said, her voice growing stronger. I've interviewed the soldiers involved. I've reviewed the intelligence assessments and the tactical analysis. And I've concluded that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we need from our non-commissioned officers. Marcus felt a surge of emotion that he struggled to control. After weeks of uncertainty and investigation, hearing these words from a 3-star general was almost overwhelming. But General Morrison wasn't finished. Which brings me to another point I want to address. There seems to be some confusion in this command about the relationship between rank and judgment, between authority and wisdom. Let me be very clear. Rank gives you the authority to give orders, but it doesn't guarantee that your orders will be wise. Experience and expertise don't always correlate with the number of bars or stars on your collar. The silence in the hangar had taken on a different quality. This was no longer just about Marcus Rodriguez. This was about fundamental questions of leadership and military culture. Good leaders listen to their people. They value experience and expertise wherever they find it. They understand that the soldier on the ground sometimes has a better understanding of the tactical situation than the officer in the rear headquarters. Most importantly, they support their subordinates when those subordinates demonstrate sound judgment and moral courage. Colonel Mitchell had begun to shift uncomfortably in his seat. It was becoming clear that General Morrison's remarks were directed at least partially toward him. Which brings me to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's Bronze Star Medal, the general said, picking up the medal from the display table. Sergeant Rodriguez, please come forward. Marcus stood and walked to the front of the hangar, his heart pounding but his bearing steady and military. As he approached the general, he could feel the eyes of every person in the hangar on him. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, General Morrison said formally, for exceptionally meritorious service in connection with military operations against an armed enemy of the United States. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez distinguished himself by outstanding leadership, tactical excellence, and devotion to duty while serving as a team leader during combat operations in Afghanistan. She pinned the Bronze Star on Marcus's uniform and shook his hand firmly. "The citation continues," she said, still speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure, adapting to changing tactical conditions while maintaining mission focus and protecting the lives of his subordinates. His actions resulted in complete mission success with 0 friendly casualties and significant enemy losses. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's courage, leadership, and tactical expertise reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The applause that followed was immediate and sustained. Soldiers throughout the hangar were clapping enthusiastically, with many of the enlisted personnel and junior officers rising to their feet. Even some of the senior officers who had initially supported Colonel Mitchell were applauding, recognizing that the political winds had shifted decisively. But the ceremony was far from over. As the applause died down, General Morrison gestured for Marcus to remain at the podium. "Before Sergeant Rodriguez returns to his seat, I want to ask him a question," she said. "Sergeant, in your opinion, what's the most important quality a military leader can possess?" It was an unexpected question, and Marcus took a moment to consider his answer carefully. He was acutely aware that his response would be remembered and repeated throughout the command. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I think the most important quality is the willingness to put your people first. Everything else, tactics, strategy, technology, is just tools. But if you're not willing to sacrifice for your soldiers, to take risks for them, to fight for them when they need you, then you're not really leading. And have you found that quality to be common among the officers you've served under?" It was a loaded question, and Marcus knew it. General Morrison was giving him an opportunity to speak truth to power, but she was also testing his judgment and his character. "Ma'am, I've been fortunate to serve under some exceptional leaders who embodied that quality. I've also served under officers who were more concerned with their own advancement than with the welfare of their soldiers. In my experience, the difference between those two types of officers is usually obvious to everyone except the officers themselves." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the hangar. Marcus had managed to answer the question honestly without directly attacking anyone, but his meaning was clear to everyone present. General Morrison nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Sergeant Rodriguez. You may return to your seat." As Marcus walked back to his chair, he could see Colonel Mitchell's face had gone from red to a deep purple. The colonel's humiliation was complete and public, and everyone in the hangar understood what had just happened. But General Morrison still wasn't finished. As Marcus took his seat, she returned to the podium for what everyone assumed would be her closing remarks. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," she said, "I want to address one final issue. It has come to my attention that some leaders in this command have allowed personal conflicts and wounded pride to interfere with their professional judgment. When a successful mission becomes the basis for disciplinary action, when soldiers who demonstrate courage and initiative are punished for their excellence, then we have a leadership problem that requires immediate correction." The hangar was completely silent again. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a 3-star general publicly dressing down a colonel in front of the entire base population. Effective immediately, Morrison announced, "Colonel James Mitchell is relieved of his command pending reassignment. Command of this base will be assumed temporarily by Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes until a permanent replacement can be appointed." The shock in the hangar was palpable. Relief of command was the ultimate professional humiliation for a military officer, reserved for cases of gross incompetence or misconduct. To have it announced publicly at a ceremony was almost unheard of. Colonel Mitchell sat frozen in his seat, his face now completely white. Around him, Other officers were staring straight ahead, afraid to look at their disgraced colleague. General Morrison's voice cut through the stunned silence. Leadership is not about protecting your own ego or punishing those who challenge your authority. Leadership is about mission accomplishment and taking care of your people. When an officer loses sight of those priorities, they forfeit their right to lead American soldiers. She paused, letting her words echo through the hangar. I expect every leader in this command to remember that lesson. The soldiers under your command deserve leaders who will fight for them, who will listen to them, who will support them when they demonstrate courage and initiative. If you can't provide that kind of leadership, then you have no business wearing the uniform of the United States Army. The ceremony concluded with the traditional protocol, but the atmosphere had been completely transformed. As soldiers filed out of the hangar, the conversations were animated and excited. They had just witnessed a complete vindication of everything they believed about leadership and justice. Marcus found himself surrounded by soldiers wanting to shake his hand and congratulate him. The Bronze Star was meaningful, but the public support of a 3-star general was something that would define the rest of his career. As he made his way toward the exit, Marcus caught sight of Colonel Mitchell, who was sitting alone in the now empty front row, staring at the floor. For just a moment, Marcus felt a flash of sympathy for the man who had tried so hard to destroy him. Mitchell's career was effectively over, his reputation ruined, his life's work reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of prideful leadership. But the sympathy was brief. Mitchell had chosen his path when he decided that his wounded ego was more important than supporting a soldier who had risked his life to protect his team. The consequences of that choice were entirely of his own making. The confrontation that had been building for months was over, but the legend of Hawk 8 was just beginning. The story of how 2 simple words would humble an arrogant colonel was still to come. 6 months after Colonel Mitchell's humiliating relief from command, forward operating base courage had transformed into a model of military excellence under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes, who had been promoted and given permanent command of the installation. The toxic atmosphere of suspicion and retaliation had been replaced by a culture of mutual respect and professional growth that attracted positive attention from throughout the theater of operations. Marcus Rodriguez had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and was serving as the senior NCO for Special Operations Training, helping to prepare newly arrived soldiers for the realities of combat in Afghanistan. His reputation had spread far beyond the confines of his home base, and he regularly received requests to brief officers and enlisted personnel about adaptive leadership and tactical decision-making. The story of the compound raid and its aftermath had become part of military folklore, told and retold in mess halls and training centers across the Army. But the most famous part of the story, the part that would cement Marcus's legend, was still to come. It began with an invitation that arrived on a sweltering July afternoon. Marcus was summoned to the base headquarters for what he assumed would be a routine briefing, but instead found himself face-to-face with Command Sergeant Major Patterson and a message that would change his life. Rodriguez, Patterson said with barely contained excitement, "You've been invited to attend the annual NCO Leadership Conference at Fort Braxton. It's a 3-day event where senior enlisted personnel from across the Army gather to discuss leadership, training, and professional development." Marcus looked at the official invitation, noting the impressive list of speakers and attendees. "That's quite an honor, Sergeant Major. I appreciate the opportunity." "Son, you don't understand," Patterson said with a grin. "You're not just attending this conference. You're one of the featured speakers. They want you to tell your story to about 800 of the Army's most senior enlisted personnel." The prospect of speaking to such a distinguished audience was both exciting and terrifying. Marcus had briefed small groups before, but addressing nearly 1,000 seasoned soldiers and NCOs was an entirely different challenge. "What exactly do they want me to talk about?" Marcus asked. "Leadership under pressure, making tough decisions, the relationship between orders and judgment. Everything you've learned from your experiences here." Marcus spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the conference, working with Patterson and other senior NCOs to develop a presentation that would be both informative and engaging. The goal was to share the lessons learned from the compound raid while providing practical guidance for other leaders facing similar situations. The flight to Fort Braxton was Marcus's first time leaving Afghanistan in over a year, and the transition back to the United States was jarring. After months of desert landscapes and military installations, the green forests of North Carolina seemed almost surreal. Fort Braxton was one of the Army's premier training installations, home to multiple special operations units and advanced military schools. The NCO Leadership Conference was held in the base's largest auditorium, a modern facility with state-of-the-art audiovisual equipment and seating for over 1,000 people. As Marcus walked through the conference registration area, he was struck by the caliber of attendees. These were the Army's most experienced and accomplished enlisted personnel, command sergeant majors, first sergeants, and senior NCOs who had decades of service and multiple deployments. Many wore ribbons and badges that told stories of service in every major conflict since Vietnam. The conference's first day consisted of presentations by general officers and senior officials discussing Army transformation, future challenges, and the evolving role of non-commissioned officers in modern warfare. Marcus attended these sessions as a participant, taking notes and absorbing insights from some of the military's most senior leaders. His own presentation was scheduled for the second morning, in the prime speaking slot immediately after the opening ceremonies. As he reviewed his notes one final time, Marcus felt the familiar pre-mission nervousness that had preceded every significant operation during his military career. The auditorium was packed when he took the stage, with additional attendees standing along the walls and in the aisles. The introduction by the conference coordinator highlighted his Bronze Star and his reputation for tactical excellence, but Marcus knew that this audience would judge him based on substance rather than awards. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. "My name is Sergeant First Class Marcus Rodriguez, and my call sign is Hawk 8. 6 months ago, I was facing the possibility of a court-martial for making a decision that saved the lives of my soldiers and accomplished our mission. Today, I'm here to talk about what that experience taught me about leadership, judgment, and the courage to do what's right." The audience was immediately attentive. This was exactly the kind of real-world leadership story they had come to hear. For the next 45 minutes, Marcus walked them through every aspect of the compound raid and its aftermath. He described the flawed intelligence, the tactical situation, the decision-making process, and the consequences of choosing mission success over blind obedience. He talked about the investigation, the political pressure, and the support of his fellow soldiers. But most importantly, he talked about the lessons learned from the experience. "The Army teaches us to follow orders," Marcus said, "but it also teaches us to think, to adapt, and to lead. Sometimes those two things conflict, and when they do, we have to make choices that define us as soldiers and as leaders. The key is understanding that leadership isn't about rank or authority. It's about responsibility." The audience was completely engaged, with many taking notes and others nodding in recognition of similar situations they had faced during their own careers. "I was fortunate to have leaders who supported me when I made a difficult decision," Marcus continued. "But not every soldier is that lucky. That's why it's so important for all of us, at every level, to create an environment where good judgment is rewarded and moral courage is supported." As Marcus concluded his presentation, the applause was immediate and sustained. These were soldiers who had seen every kind of leadership presentation, but they recognized authentic experience and hard-won wisdom when they heard it. The question and answer session that followed was equally engaging, with senior NCOs asking detailed questions about decision-making processes, risk assessment, and the challenges of balancing initiative with discipline. Marcus answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on his experiences while acknowledging the complexity of leadership challenges. After the session ended, Marcus was surrounded by attendees who wanted to continue the conversation. Stories were shared, contact information exchanged, and professional relationships established that would last for years to come. But the most significant moment came during the conference's final evening, at a reception hosted by the base commander for all attendees. Marcus was standing with a group of command sergeant majors, discussing training methodologies, when he noticed a commotion near the reception's entrance. A group of officers had entered the ballroom, and among them was a face that Marcus recognized immediately. Colonel James Mitchell, now wearing the rank of lieutenant colonel and looking distinctly uncomfortable in the social setting. Mitchell had been reassigned to a staff position at Fort Braxton after his relief from command, a career move that was widely understood to be a dead-end posting for officers who had fallen from grace. His presence at the reception was technically appropriate given his current assignment, but clearly unwelcome given the circumstances. As Mitchell moved through the reception, conversations seemed to pause and then resume in more muted tones. Word of his disgrace had followed him from Afghanistan, and his reputation as a vindictive leader who had been publicly humiliated by his own soldiers was well known throughout the military community. Marcus watched Mitchell's progress through the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Part of him felt sympathy for the man whose career had been destroyed by pride and poor judgment. But another part remembered the weeks of harassment, investigation, and uncertainty that Mitchell had put him and his team through. The confrontation that would become military legend happened almost by accident. Mitchell, apparently seeking to avoid further social discomfort, was making his way toward the reception's exit when his path intersected with the group surrounding Marcus. For a moment, the two men found themselves face to face for the first time since the ceremony where Mitchell had been relieved of command. The conversation around them gradually died as other attendees noticed the encounter. Within seconds, a circle of interested observers had formed, all waiting to see how this unexpected meeting would play out. Mitchell's face went through a range of emotions: surprise, anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been resignation. He was clearly debating whether to acknowledge Marcus or simply continue toward the exit. Finally, Mitchell spoke, his voice carrying a forced casualness that fooled no one present. "Well," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "if it isn't the famous Hawk 8, I suppose you're quite proud of yourself, aren't you? Destroying a superior officer's career, turning the Army upside down with your insubordination." The circle of observers grew larger as more attendees noticed the confrontation. Marcus felt all eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond to this public challenge from the man who had tried to destroy his career. Marcus looked at Mitchell for a long moment, taking in the man's bitter expression and defeated posture. He thought about everything that had happened: the successful mission, the investigation, the public vindication, the relief from command. He thought about his team, about the soldiers who had supported him, about the leaders who had stood up for him when it mattered. And then Marcus Rodriguez, known throughout the Army as Hawk 8, delivered the response that would be repeated in military circles for decades to come. "Thank you," he said simply. 2 words. That's all it took. The silence that followed was deafening. Mitchell's face went from bitter anger to confusion to a dawning realization of what had just happened. Everyone present understood immediately what those 2 words meant. Thank you for showing everyone the difference between leadership and authority. Thank you for demonstrating what happens when pride becomes more important than mission success. Thank you for proving that good soldiers will always triumph over bad officers. Thank you for being exactly the kind of leader that the Army doesn't need. Thank you for making it possible for better leaders to emerge. Thank you for your service as a cautionary tale." Mitchell stood frozen for several seconds, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. But there was nothing he could say. Those 2 words had captured the entire situation more effectively than any speech or argument could have done. The elegance of the response was perfect. Marcus hadn't been disrespectful or insubordinate. He hadn't violated any military protocol or engaged in personal attacks. He had simply expressed gratitude in the most devastating way possible. Finally, Mitchell turned and walked rapidly toward the exit, his departure witnessed by nearly 100 senior military personnel who would carry the story with them to every corner of the Army. As the crowd began to disperse and conversations resumed, Marcus found himself surrounded by admirers who appreciated both the content and the style of his response. "Son," said Command Sergeant Major William Torres, a 30-year veteran with service dating back to Vietnam, "that was the most perfect response I've ever heard to a situation like that. Those two words are going to be remembered for a long time." He was right. The story spread throughout the military with the speed of digital communications and the embellishment that comes with repeated telling. Within weeks, soldiers throughout the Army were talking about the sergeant who had silenced an arrogant colonel with just 2 words. The legend of Hawk 8 grew with each telling. In some versions, the confrontation took place in a packed auditorium. In others, it happened during a formal ceremony. The details varied, but the core story remained consistent. A good soldier had been vindicated, a bad officer had been humiliated, and justice had been served with perfect elegance. Marcus Rodriguez returned to Afghanistan with his reputation enhanced and his future secure. He would go on to serve with distinction for many more years, eventually retiring as a command sergeant major with a career full of accomplishments and accolades. But he would always be remembered first and foremost as Hawk 8, the sergeant who proved that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the simplest ones, and that 2 words delivered at the right moment can carry more force than any artillery barrage. The story of thank you became a teaching tool in military leadership courses, a reminder that true strength comes from confidence rather than bluster, and that the best responses to bullies are often the quietest ones. And in mess halls and barracks around the world, whenever soldiers talked about leadership, justice, and the courage to do what's right, someone would inevitably tell the story of the veteran who silenced the colonel with just one reply, "Thank you." Those 2 words became a symbol of everything the military aspired to be: professional, respectful, effective, and utterly devastating when necessary. They proved that the pen might be mightier than the sword, but sometimes a simple expression of gratitude is the most powerful weapon of all.